This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pledger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello everyone, this is your host Andrew Pledger, and I am so excited for you to hear this two-part episode with Rich Merritt. And I want to tell you a little bit about him before we get into this episode. So Rich is an author, attorney, and LGBTQ plus activist who has led a remarkable life. He was born in Greenville, South Carolina, to fundamentalist parents. He attended the Bob Jones schools from a young age all the way until the university, and he was at the university for 2 years and transferred to Clemson. He enlisted in the Marine Corps and served as a sergeant and an officer, while also appearing in adult films. He graduated from the University of Southern California Law School and served as a lawyer in California, Georgia, and New York. He wrote his memoir, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star, in 2005. He has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, The Advocate, and Washington Post. And I am so excited for you to hear Rich's story. Now, let's get into this episode of Beyond BJU. I'm really curious about your transition growing up at the elementary school, the academy, high school, and then entering Bob Jones University. What were your feelings about that environment in general after it being your entire world?
As time has gone on, one of the things that I've realized the importance of, and Dr. Camille Lewis has this, she uses the term the memory hole. And I love that because it's right out of George Orwell, 1984. But Bob Jones does this thing. They put the past through the memory hole. It's like it never happened. And one of the things that I want to address here, because it's really formative for me, was the 1983, I think, Supreme Court decision. I mean, Bob Jones University is a white supremacist institution. It is a white Christian nationalist institution. That's why it was founded. It was founded as part of that movement. Call it what you want, but that's what it is. And if you look back at Bob Sr.'s teaching as late as the 60s, and he died in the late 60s, but I still remember his sermon played on the university's radio station. If you are against segregation, then you are against God Almighty. So that's what I'm growing up with. Segregation now, segregation forever. And what happened was, after he died, the university has never disavowed his teaching. But the rule at first was there were no Black people allowed at all. And then they began allowing married Black people, which kind of led to something. It really was all about mixing of the races. Like, that's what they can't stand. So they started allowing Black married people, but then they started allowing unmarried Black students, but then they instituted a rule that the three races, if there are only three, could not intermarry or date. blacks, Asians, and whites. And that was the rule. And that was the rule when I was there. The Internal Revenue Service revoked their tax exempt status. Bob Jones University paid $1 in taxes and then sued to get it back. And that became the genesis for the Supreme Court decision. So by 1982 or 83, you've got this decision defending their right to segregate the races going up to the Supreme Court. So every day there were news crews, national television news crews, NBC, ABC, CBS, coming onto our little campus here in Greenville, South Carolina. I would go home at night and in the 8th, 9th grade, watch this on the news. There would be Tom Brokaw or one of the others talking about a report from Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. And so for a kid like that, this was mind-blowing. A few years earlier, I had shaken Ronald Reagan's hand and Nancy Reagan's hand as they spoke on the campus. And now this was happening. So it was really mind-blowing. And of course, it was a huge deal. And then when I still remember Bob III standing up there announcing that we had lost the decision. And you would have thought the black helicopters were about to come flying over Paris Mountain. I mean, it was apocalyptic. The way the tanks are going to come rolling, they're going to destroy us. This is the worst thing in the world. While all this was going on, I had a teacher. Now, he had been my counselor that first summer at the Wilds. He was from California. He was really cool. He kind of had that cool California vibe, which you didn't see a whole lot at Bob Jones. But he was my counselor and then became my Bible teacher. And then in the 9th grade, he moved up to the academy, so he was my Bible teacher again. And he said in class, there is no scriptural support for separation of the races. That was the first chink in the armor for me, because I realized, what? We're all the way at the Supreme Court, and you're a teacher here saying there's no scriptural support for separation of the races. So I did something that not a whole lot of Christians do. I read the Bible, and I began to realize he's right. There is no scriptural support for what we've just gone all the way to the Supreme Court about. And then when you fast forward to 2000, when I'm in California, happen to be watching CNN, and there's Larry King. Had no idea there's Bob III on Larry King in my television in Huntington Beach, California. And he says, because the whole George Bush thing that had happened, John McCain thing, he said, we're going to end the rule. It was never really that big of a deal anyway. Are you kidding me? You went all the way to the Supreme Court defending your right to do this, and you're going to have the arrogance and the gall to sit here and on live television with Larry King and say it was never that big a deal anyway. It just blew my mind. Like, how I've been right about you all along. I have. And the fact that you can sit here and say that, but that whole issue was the thing that in the 83, 84, I began to realize there's something not right here. It's like that scene in the original Matrix movie when Morpheus says to Neo, or says to Tom Anderson, there's something wrong here. It's like a splinter in your mind. That described my experience around these years of Bob Jones. There's a splinter in my mind. This is the only universe I've ever known. Fundamentalism is my matrix. And there's something wrong here. But I didn't know exactly how to.
And how old were you when that kind of happened?
I was 15 when the Supreme Court decision came down. And I started thinking, maybe there are other options. Maybe there's other places I can go. And an uncle encouraged me to look at the service academies. So my junior year, it would have been around 84. I was in the 11th grade. In order for me to get a transcript, so I applied to the Naval Academy. And so for me to get a transcript released from Bob Jones, I had to go see the provost of the university. I'm a 16-year-old high school kid sitting in the office with, I think his name was Phil Smith. Anyway, and this gruff, he looked like he was 100. He's probably a lot younger than I am now, but he looked like he was 100 years old. And he said to me, it's God's will for every Christian young person to go to Bob Jones University. And I said, I actually think it's God's will for me to go to the Naval Academy. And he said, we'll find out, won't we? Or he didn't say that, but it was something along those lines. It just, that was the other thing, the chink in the armor, it starts to grow wide. There's something really wrong here. And so I didn't get into the Naval Academy, but by then I really wanted to go. And so I thought, if I join the reserves, and I wanted to go to the Naval Academy to become a Marine Corps officer. So I thought, if I join the reserves, and that'll maybe show the Naval Academy how serious I am. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves, and that's what I did the second semester of my freshman year at BJU.
Okay, and then so you ended up going to Bob Jones University. You were there a very short time, but what were those experiences like for you?
When I joined the Marine Corps Reserves, I went to Parris Island, South Carolina, for boot camp. And it's as bad as you've seen in the movies, and it's like being in prison. The only thing that's different between it and prison is you're going to be getting out you hope you're going to be getting out in 3 months, assuming you pass all the tests. If you don't, they just hold you back, and it might take you 5 or 6 months to get out. But it's torture. I mean, it's hell. I had a rack mate at boot camp who was Catholic. And it was my first experience being really close with a Catholic person. And it occurred to me, and we were really tight, and I thought, if we go to war and he gets killed, his soul's not going to hell. They're full of crap at Bob Jones, telling me that he's not born again, like he's not going to heaven. I also had a black drill instructor who was from New Jersey, and he hated me. He let me know he hated me because I think he knew I went to Bob Jones. They all knew. But to call him sir, to be from a very Southern country, rural family, to go to Bob Jones, a white supremacist school like Bob Jones, and to suddenly have to show this respect and deference to a black man, call him sir, salute him, that was mind-blowing for me. And it was life-changing. Years later, when I would give the interviews after my memoir came out, one of the most common questions I was asked was, how do you go from being a Ronald Reagan campaign? Because I campaigned for Ronald Reagan when I was in junior high. How do you go from that to what you are now, being a liberal LGBT rights activist? And I say, I joined the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, for me, coming from Bob Jones, was a very liberalizing, equalizing experience, and it was good for me. So that was very eye-opening. But I was in the reserves. When I left boot camp, I went to an MLS school in Alabama. And I loved your story, Andrew, how you talk about the story when you're in the dorms at Bob Jones University on a Sunday morning, the bell goes off and you just roll over between the mattress and the wall. Yeah. And you got away with it. And that was a life-changing moment for you. For me, I still remember I was in Huntsville, Alabama, and I was leaving the Redstone Arsenal, and I was going to visit a friend who actually he went to Pensacola, but I knew him from the wilds. On the way there, I couldn't find a Christian radio station, or it was terrible. My roommate at the barracks would always listen to Madonna. I don't know looking back, I should have explored that more, but I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. And I heard this song that he had played that I really liked. It was Live to Tell. A man can tell 1,000 lies. I've learned my lesson. And I thought, I can't listen to that. But I left it on there for a minute, and then I asked God to forgive me, and I changed the station. It was a really crappy Christian station. And so I changed it back, and I left it on the Madonna song. That was the beginning of the end for me. Even now, 40 years later, I hear it. I remember that moment. For me, it began with the music. I still remember the late Ron Hamilton's anti-rock music lectures. I used to kind of love them because that was the only time I would ever let myself listen to rock music, was the things that he would play. But yeah, I started listening to music, and then I came back to Bob Jones. I also had my first drink. I drank a beer for the first time, and that was at the Enlisted Men's Club in Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. I didn't really care for it, but I drank another beer. But that was my first experience drinking beer, and I thought,
what year was this?
That was 86. This was the semester that I was out, so I came back to Bob Jones after this, after having had my taste of beer and my taste of Madonna. I was never going to be the same. And I went back to campus, but I was a Marine now. I was a Marine reservist. I was drilling with the reserve unit in Greenville. And I was like, this place is really small. Like, it's really closed minded. I'd had that experience where I just don't think these people are going to hell. But it was really that concept that these people are all not going to hell. And that was the shattering of the delusion of fundamentalism that we were talking about earlier. That's when I began to realize, oh, that's where this whole thing falls apart. There can't be this loving God that created all these souls that are going to spend eternity in hell. It cannot be. I started hanging out with some kids at work. I worked at Swenson's, and there was an ice cream parlor over by the mall, Haywood Mall. And there was a group of us from Bob Jones that worked there. In fact, Bobby the fourth was one of them. He had come back to school at this point. And there was another Bob Jones student. And of course, I talk about his attractiveness. I've been accused over the years, people who've read my memoir said, you are really obsessed with the way people look. And I thought, I am not. And now when I read my memoir, I was real, like that was the thing with me. Like I'm going to comment on a person's attractiveness. So I try not to do that as much anymore. But the thing I remember that really motivated me was this guy was really good looking. And he went to Bob Jones and he was in Basilian. Is that still a society?
It is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was in Basilian. I was in Omega, of course. I say, of course, because all the academy kids went there. But he's, hey, let's get a beer after work. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm down with that. Even though I hadn't really cared for beer before. This
and
time
sorry,
it was,
who said this to you?
The Basilian guy.
Okay, got you.
Yeah. So that was when I started hanging out with the reprobates, because I'd always been the good kid, the kid who kept all the rules, who did all the good stuff. And this point, I came back after the Marines. When I went on my weekend reserve drills, and I would drink with those guys, and there were some Bob Jones people there. So eventually it got back to the administration that I was swearing at work. I was listening to rock music. I was drinking beer. And then I started it would have been my second semester sophomore year. I started getting the call slips, come see the dean. And that's when the first one, when the dean had the, are you bitter because your parents aren't right with God talk. He said, I'm not going to tell you what we know that you've done, because I'm not going to give you a chance just to sit there and lie to me. I actually think it was Jim Berg who said that to me. Because I went to
wow, yeah, that checks. Yeah.
I remember now when he made the comment, are you bitter because your parents aren't right with God? I said, I'm out of here. In my mind, I checked out at that point. But I said, I'm just going to wait. I'm going to finish the semester. The next time I got a call slip, I'm like, you know what? They're going to expel me, and they're just going to string me along because I was paying my tuition on the first of every month. That's the way we could do it back then. And I had seen them do this. They would expel people that second week of December, right before finals. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to let them do that to me. So that's when I went to withdraw, and Berg said to me, we're not just going to tell you what we've done, because we're not going to give you a chance just to sit there and lie to me. And he made some analogy like, you've got to pay the bill before you can vacate or something. I was like, what? Let me just let me go. And I had to sign this thing waiving my right to a hearing before the discipline committee. And I had to turn in my ID, and I had to acknowledge that I would not be allowed on campus for a year, that no one on the campus will be allowed to talk to me, or no one who is still a current student. And you have to remember, I had been there since the first grade. Everyone I knew, every friend I had was associated with this school. So in one fell swoop, when I drove off campus to Belinda Carlisle screaming, heaven is a place on earth, as I drove past the guard. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. But I lost every friend I'd ever had, except for a couple who didn't care and still hung out with me.
It is a very difficult thing when you realize that there were people in your life where their love was dependent on what you believed and even your own actions with that. But so you got out of Bob Jones University, and I think you transferred to Clemson, didn't you? I think.
Yeah, a semester later, I transferred to Clemson. Bob Jones wasn't accredited back then, so you couldn't just transfer. Years later, after my book came out, someone wrote me, a very kind, wonderful man. He's since deceased, but his name was Charlie. And Charlie had been the admissions director at Furman for many years. And he would notice like students from Bob Jones would show up at across from his desk saying they might identify as queer or they might not, but he could tell. And at first he couldn't do anything for them, but eventually he somehow got an exception in the rules or something to where he would get people to transfer for that reason. I don't know why I was allowed to transfer to Clemson. Clemson took Bob Jones's credits. I mean, I've heard a rumor that it was because Senator Strom Thurmond was on the board of both institutions. I don't know if that's true or not, but for whatever reason, I transferred to Clemson. Most of my credits transferred, and I eventually finished there. I had a good friend right away through the Marines. I met someone at Clemson through the Marine Corps Officer Commissioning Program. His name was Gary, and Gary took me under his wing. He introduced me to his friends. He was like my bridge to this new world. I don't know if I would have made it through those years without him, without his kindliness and his friendship.
Yeah, I'm glad you were able to find that community beyond BJU. And something I'm really curious about is what was your experience as a gay man in the Marines? And what really stood out to me too is the don't ask, don't tell policy. So what was your experiences with that in the military? Because it sounds like it took you a while, and because understandably with like lack of access to information, but from what I remember reading the book, was it in the Marines that you finally admitted to yourself that you were gay, or when did that finally happen?
I had been in the Marines for a number of years at that point. When I first joined the reserves and went to boot camp, back then it was 86. It was early 86. They had just come out with a test they didn't even call it HIV. It was called HTLV3. And the fact that they were testing you for that was, are you testing me? I'm not gay. That was my attitude back then. And I went from having to give blood for that test, and then the doctor is standing there. Are you a homosexual? I'm like, no. Do you ever have any intention of engaging in any homosexual activities? I don't remember exactly what the questions were on the form, but those were asked. These were the years before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, when it was just a complete outright ban on serving in the military. And I, of course, hadn't even come to terms with my own sexual identity. There had been a moment when I was 17. I was a senior in the academy, I think. There was an administrator. He had been the head of the discipline committee. His name was Craig Olson. I really liked Mr. Olson. He was just this big bear of a man, very kindly, I thought, but his job was head of the discipline committee. So he had a really tough job. He moved up to be like a counselor or something. And I remember going to talk to him. Like I was crossing the campus to talk to him about my sexual thoughts about some of the friends that I had, and walking across, did they call it the Bridge of Nations, or is that in my memory?
That's what people refer to it as, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, whatever that bridge is next to the cemetery. I was halfway, yeah, because that's where Dr. Bob Sr. is buried. I'm like halfway across that bridge. It was like I heard his voice say, do right till the stars fall. And I thought, I can do this on my own. And I literally did an about face and walked back to the academy because I was like, I don't need to go tell anyone about this. And I didn't. I didn't think about it again until I think I hooked up with my first time having sex was with a guy, another Clemson student. And I loved it, but felt guilty after. I mean, I liked the sex, but felt really guilty after. So I didn't even deal with that again. I didn't have sex again until I was at an Army base in El Paso, Texas. And some guy hit on me in the locker room. And next thing I know, I'm at his house, and he was a soldier who worked on the base. So that was my second time. And I would come away from it each time rationalizing, justifying, denying, coming up with all kinds of excuses. I'm not gay. I'm not queer. I'm just experimenting. I'm just all the reasons, and anything but the actual reason that I am gay. But when I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, the year was 1992. Bill Clinton was running for president the first time. And in order to get the Democratic nomination, he had promised to end the ban on, I won't say LGBT because back then the T was not part of the conversation. Transgender people were just not discussed. But the lesbian and gay men, to get Democratic votes, he said he would lift the ban to let lesbians and gay men serve in the military. And that's all because he was making this promise. And as he began winning the Democratic primaries and it began to look like he was going to win the nomination, the Marines were talking about it all the time. And of course, not favorably at all. But the thing is, hearing all these discussions, I could no longer keep it on the back burner. I had to think about what I was thinking, the thoughts that I had, the feelings that I had. Halfway through my year overseas in 92, there was a lieutenant coming from California, and there were rumors that he was gay. And some people said, no, he's not gay. I'm like, I got to find out what this is about. And so he and I got to be friends. And one night we got drunk together and I found out, yeah, he's gay and so am I. And that was right before I left Okinawa to come back to California. Bill Clinton had just been elected president. He had taken office, and there were service members who came out of the closet the day after Bill Clinton was inaugurated. Some of them were immediately discharged because, of course, the rule hadn't been changed at that point. Someone who would later become my friend, Justin Elzy. Justin Elzy came out. He was an active duty Marine who came out on ABC News in early 1993. And they tried to discharge him, but there was some loophole where Justin was allowed to serve out his enlistment on active duty as a gay man, but that was rare. What happened was there was so much opposition to Bill Clinton's proposal, even among the Democrats, like the senior Democrat senator from Georgia, Sam Nunn. He's the one who coined the term, I think, don't ask, don't tell. And that became the name of the law. And now looking back, that's how Bill Clinton lived his life. Don't ask, don't tell. And he just thought we could do it too. You can be gay, just don't let anyone know it. But when you start thinking about what the ramifications of that are, it just doesn't add up. I can't hang out with, if there's a group of us that I normally wouldn't be hanging out with in Oceanside, California, right outside the base, if people already think I might be gay and they think there's other people might be gay, you could get an investigation launched for any reason. And military investigators could investigate people's sexual orientation. And the number of discharges during those years after 93, 94, I think is when he signed it into law, the number of discharges for homosexuality increased because of don't ask, don't tell. So that was my experience. As I saw what was happening, I became more militant. Now that I'm out and semi-out, I can't be completely out, but I started going to gay pride events and encountering the Westboro Baptist Church, the God Hates Fags people, getting in their face and becoming very vocal and loud. That was my experience during those years.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And as you were in the military, how did you get involved in the adult film industry? When did that come into play?
It was around this same time. So the first time I ever saw gay porn was at that Army base in El Paso. I was just reading the newspaper and I saw this ad for an adult theater way out in the desert, way outside of town. And it had this big thing that said gay porn. And I'm like, oh my God, what is that? I'm just going to go find out what this is. So late one night after training, I drove, it was 20 miles out in the middle of nowhere, but it was this big compound. And that was the first time I saw gay porn. And I already had gay sex a couple times, so I knew the mechanics of it. But to actually see it was a different thing. And I thought, God, that would be so exciting to be in that. Kind of put it out of my mind. When I was stationed in California, I'd put on a lot of weight, or put on some weight. And when I checked into my unit at Camp Pendleton, the major looked at me and said, you need to lose some weight, Marine. And so I started running, started working out, got in really good shape for the first time in my life. And that appealed to my narcissism. And once again, I was kind of flipping through the base newspaper, in the military base newspaper. In the back of it, they had ads, adult models wanted. One of them even said no porn, which of course it's porn. So I thought, well, I would never do it, but I'll just call and see if I could do it. So I called the number, and next thing I know, I'm in eight gay pornographic videos over a period of 4 months. And it was exciting. It was fun. I'm an adrenaline junkie, and it was just a big shot of adrenaline. And then I would feel guilty afterward, and I think I'm never doing that again. And then a week later, a producer would call and say, "Oh, I saw you in this video. Do you want to be in another one?" And it was not much money, but it was a little bit of money, and it was validation. It was like, oh, not only are you good looking, but you're good looking enough to have somebody pay you to have sex on film. I wasn't thinking clearly at this point because I would have realized the risk I was putting myself in. The irony is I was actually going to the legal officers training program at this point. It was like a month-long course. I wasn't a lawyer yet, but I was interested in becoming a lawyer. So they sent me to the legal officers course. And I'm literally learning about Article 123 or 125, I can't remember which one, of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which says the article that makes it a crime to commit sodomy. And then there's an extra 3 years for each penalty for what's called aggravated sodomy. Aggravated sodomy is on film or for money or in public. And some of my videos have been all three. So I'm like, this is stupid. What am I doing here? But it feels so good. That's a hallmark of an addict, right? That's years later, I would have to grapple with that. But that was early manifestations of it. If I could go back and advise my younger self, I would say, why don't you not do this? But those years also, it was before the internet.
Yeah.
It was on VHS tape. You had to go to an adult bookstore. I told the producer, I said, I don't want my picture on the box cover.
And he's, oh no, we won't put your picture on the box cover.
Because I thought that would be the thing. But anyone who's going to see my video is going to have to be culpable themselves, because they're going to have to go to a seedy part of town, go to one of these bookstores, find it, play it, do whatever they do with it. And they're guilty. If someone had told me in just a few years, there's going to be this thing invented where anyone in the world can watch one of these videos at any time, I might have thought a little differently about it. But, back then, a whole lot of people weren't doing porn like everybody's doing it now. It was a very unusual thing to do. But I stopped, like I said, I think it was 8 videos. I mean, they repackaged those things. So I think I shot 8 scenes and over 4 months. And I stopped only when I met someone. I met a man and fell in love for the first time in my life. And I realized this might not be conducive to a relationship. So I stopped doing that. The next time a producer called, I politely thanked him and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And that's why I stopped.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your journey through that. Wow. And something I'm really curious about too is, like, do you think like you were maybe what made you more maybe addiction prone was the way that you were raised, or maybe the things that you went through of not getting that love and that validation of that maybe emotional neglect or needs not being met? Or was it, do you think, a mix of maybe like personality, brain chemistry, and also experiences?
Addictionologists, the doctors who focus their lives on studying this, from what I can gather, they believe there's probably a genetic component for addiction, but it's genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. So I think with addiction, with me, it's, if you look at my family, there's a genetic predisposition throughout my family for addiction, for alcoholism. So assuming I've got that, then I come into an environment, most people who specialize in addiction will say that shame is the root of almost all addiction. So you've done a great job in this podcast series of exploring shame and all the shame that we dealt with. I look at a lot of people. I mean, most of the LGBTQ people who've gone through what I went through did not become addicts. So I can't say it's purely because of that. But I think when you have the genetic predisposition for it, and then the environment that we grow up in, and then the third element that you need is the substance, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, whether it's sex, whether it's gambling, whether it's shopping, whether it's eating, then you add that to it, and you've got the perfect recipe for addiction, for substance use disorder.
Yes. And something I realized when I started reading your book, the title, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star, it's really out there and it's really attention grabbing. When I read it, I was like, for me, I felt like you were like, you know what? I'm done with the shame. Yeah, I was a
Oh,
gay Marine porn
yeah.
star. Deal with it.
That was the goal.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of the end of the shame, but it would be I wrote that book in 2005. So when I quit doing the porn and I got into a relationship with just a wonderful man named David, in the book, I think I call him Brandon. I don't think he was out to his family at the time. So I used a fake name, but his real name is David. I'm living this now life of a married couple. But I needed an outlet for my rage after the Don't Ask, Don't Tell fiasco. I mean, part of the reason I did the porn was everyone was saying homosexuality is incompatible with military service. I thought, oh, really? I'm going to get promotions. I'm going to get awards. And I did. And I'm going to be as gay as I can be for all the world to see. And I was. So there was kind of that fuck you element to it, to the Republicans, to the government, to the Marine Corps. That was all part of the mix of why I did the porn. But after I stopped, there's still that rage. So what am I going to do? I had a friend in the Marines named Michael. He's, like I said, I'm grateful to Bob Jones for all my friendships. I am deeply grateful to the Marine Corps for the friendships I still have today. Michael and I keep in touch every few months. He comes to Atlanta to visit once in a while. So in 96, his job is he's the aide to one of the two generals at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, the old air station in Orange County, California. I was selected to be the aide to the other. And so together, the two of us queer Marines are like keeping this base running perfectly. And Michael, he read one of my emails and he said, the Navy Marine Corps Times is looking for an op-ed column or a columnist to write weekly or every other biweekly. You should submit that. And so that I submitted a couple of articles and I was selected to write this column in the Navy Marine Corps Times. And so every other week I was getting to publish. The interesting thing was I wasn't even using my real name. The Navy Marine Corps, or the editors at this paper, it was a civilian-owned paper, but it was a military paper run by a civilian company, distributed or sold on the bases. And they wanted someone to write under a pseudonym so that they could be honest. It was almost very Bob Jones-like in that you can't put your own name on something and speak your mind. The military was very much like that too. So the editor said, we want you to use a fake name. I chose my boyfriend's dog's name. He had a dachshund. He had two dachshunds. One of them was named Buster. And so I wrote this column for 2 years under the name of Buster Pittman. And so that became the outlet for my rage. And most of the columns weren't about LGBT issues. They were just, I did take a very left-leaning perspective. Like I wrote an article that said women should be allowed to serve in combat. I got a lot of hate mail for that. I wrote another article that said adultery should not be a felony under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Got a lot of hate mail for that. I love getting hate mail. Finally, not long before I got out, I wrote an article that said, I used a hook as an outgoing judge. He said someday, and this is around late 97, that someday Don't Ask, Don't Tell will be buried in the Hall of Shame, along with the internment of Japanese prisoners during World War II, along with Dred Scott, all these horrible decisions. He said that Don't Ask, Don't Tell would go the same way. And of course, he was right. But in 97, it was still the law on the books. So I used that as a hook to write this column. And there were a couple of other things that were going on. There had been a sailor in Hawaii discharged right before his 20-year retirement because someone used his anonymous AOL profile. They returned him over to the Naval Investigative Service. NIS got a subpoena to get AOL's records to determine that this guy was gay. and they kicked him out for violating Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You can imagine that kind of sent this shock wave through the community. Wait a second, we thought you could be gay and in the military, but this is what the Navy's doing. The New York Times Magazine, they hired a young writer. She'd already written a few novels and stories. Her name was Jennifer Egan. They hired Jennifer Egan to write a feature cover story for the New York Times Magazine about what life was like under Don't Ask, Don't Tell for active duty service people. And I think she wanted to get as far away from the whole New York, Washington axis as possible. So she came out to San Diego. Because of my article and some volunteer work I had done for the Service Members Legal Defense Network, she reached out to them and they put her in touch with me. And I introduced Jennifer to about 20 service members in San Diego. We had a dinner at a friend's house, and she wrote this beautiful 8,000-word piece. Jennifer, I mean, since then she's won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. She's one of our greatest writers. And she recognized what we were going through, like what this policy really means. Like, you can't live a life under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, not a normal life. And her article did a great job of putting this back on the radar of the community and realizing we need to get serious about ending this. Of course, it would take another, 10 years, but eventually it would happen. But that New York Times Magazine cover story came out June 28th, 1998. It was the 29th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. It was gay pride or queer pride in New York City. I did not have a good understanding of what the New York Times Magazine was. I had never read it. I thought it was like the Parade, the Sunday Supplement. Of course, it was huge. It was the next thing I know, I'm being called into my commanding officer's office. I had been anonymous in the article. She only used my first initial R, but it didn't take much to figure out that this was me. My battalion commander showed me the article and said, "There's a lot of people who think this is you," and he held up his hand. "I'm not going to ask if this is you. Whoever this is did not, I've talked to the JAG officers on base, the military lawyers, and whoever did this did not violate Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I'm not going to violate Don't Ask, Don't Tell by asking you. So you're getting out of the Marines in 6 weeks, right?" Because I'd already submitted my discharge papers. And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Okay, good. If you have any problem, will you let me know?" A lot went on behind the scenes to make sure I didn't get in trouble. SLDN had got involved. I was allowed to get out in 6 weeks and get my honorable discharge, and I went to law school. The story doesn't end there, because I was at a fundraiser for SLDN when a freelance writer came up to me and said, "I want to do a story about who you really are, because you're anonymous. We can't really tell. We don't see your face in the picture on the cover. Will that be okay?" And I said, "Okay." I'll admit I like attention. I like being featured in a story. It felt good. And so I said yes. And I went with him to the offices of The Advocate, which was a leading LGBT news magazine at the time. And we met the editor. And they sent a photographer out and took some pictures. And early in 1999, there was a story in The Advocate about who was this anonymous Marine. The next thing I know, I get a call from The Advocate. "Someone recognized you from some pornographic videos. Is this you?" I wish I had looking back, I probably should have just been honest with him and said, "Yeah, so what?" Relying on the advice of counsel, I just said, "I don't have a comment." And they ran a story that at the time I thought it was very negative. It was shocking to me. As I clutched my pearls, I was so horrified by this story. I read it a few years ago and I'm like, yeah, it's not that bad. They were just reporting what had happened. Some psychiatrist did a story about why powerful men like Rich Merritt and Bill Clinton do these sexually risky things, like get a blowjob in the Oval Office or have gay porn while they're on active duty. That was weird, because I never talked to the psychiatrist. And also to see that equation. I took it very negatively. I was in law school at the time. It was a lot of pressure. First year of law school was a lot of pressure anyway. It led me into a lot of depression. And this is when I began using drugs for the first time. I was out of the Marines. I was no longer getting drug screened. And that's when all that started happening. So for a number of reasons, the depression being one of them, the increasing addiction, trying to stop using on my own, not being able to stop using on my own, not really seeking out help. In early 2002, that led me to attempt suicide. And I was hospitalized in California, they have the 72-hour, it's called a 5150, that they can put you in a mental institution for 72 hours. When I got out of the hospital, I started writing. I started writing a book. Now, I loved writing. I'd always written fiction. I had a bunch of fiction manuscripts that never went anywhere. Actually, one of them would get published. But at this point, I just started writing what would become a memoir. And I sent it around to a few friends, and they said, you should get this published. I mean, that's what friends always say if they're good friends. But I think they meant it. And I said, sure, why not? I met my friend Gary, who was a straight active duty Marine officer at the time. And I think he was still active duty. And I told him everything. He was the first person I met after I left Bob Jones 15 years earlier. He's always stood by me. I told him everything, and he just started laughing. And he said, yeah, you need to get this published. And he started riffing on the title. I was a Bible thumping, fudge packing mental patient or something like that. He's a Marine Corps. He's a Top Gun fighter pilot. And I'm like, yeah, something like that. It was confessions of something in the title. I reached out to a few publishers. Ironically, The Advocate had a book publishing company, and one of their editors became very helpful, a woman named Terry. Terry put me in touch with Charles Casillo. Charles is a celebrity biographer, and Charles is the one who took Gary's title and molded it into what you have now, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star. So between those two very important men in my life, that became the title. That's where that title comes from.
I was looking in the book, and I think on a page it says, our secrets keep us sick. And it's from one of your therapists. And it is so true. And it's so devastating being in an environment where you cannot be open about who you are. And like, you had that in fundamentalism, but then you also had that in the military, a different reasoning for that oppression. And yeah, I'm sorry about everything that happened with the articles and it driving you to that point to go to substances to try to cope with that, because just I can only imagine the pain from all of that and like the shame, that exposure from it. But as you dealt with that and really writing the book and then publishing it, like, what were the feelings that came when you were done with the book?
I wish I could say that the book it did everything that I wanted it to do. Because the book was successful. My publisher regards it. It went to 4 printings. So the way the book ends is that I started writing it and I still didn't have an ending for it. But during the process of writing it, I went to my first 12-step meeting. And I looked at it, oh, this is the perfect ending for my book, going to 12-step meeting. And so I had about 6 months sober when I wrote my memoir, when I published my memoir. I don't recommend that for anyone. It's interesting that at the time we're recording this, Matthew Perry just died from drowning. And I had kind of a flashback when he was doing his book tour. Like, it's too soon. You're doing this too soon. And there's a comedian from Saturday Night Live who's I hope he's thriving, who does a comedy thing on HBO or on Netflix, I think. And I just get this feeling, but it's my own experience. It was too soon. Get some time under your belt. Put the principles of recovery into your life. Live a life of service for a few years before you add this to your repertoire of service. And then you'll have a different perspective of it. And I wish that is what I had done, but I didn't. I mean, it happened the way it happened. In the 12, in AA, that we have to have a higher power. You have to find a God as you understand God. I have a horrible experience with God, and I couldn't really incorporate a God of my own understanding. And honestly, that book became my higher power. When you write a book about yourself and start promoting it and say, that's going to be the thing that saves me, you're destined for not a good place. And when the book did so well, then the calls started coming in, the meetings started happening about a movie deal, meeting producers, meeting directors, meeting screenwriters. For an addict who's not really in recovery, that became the drug. And I wanted more, and for a year or two, it was happening. And then it didn't. And when it went away, I sank into a really long period of depression that I'm still just, it's been over the last 5 years that I'm finally recovering from. And it requires a process of ego deflation. Honestly, the ego is what gets in our way, at least for me. And so I haven't done anything like this interview for many years. And I felt like listening to your podcast that, okay, I can add to this. I can add to what you're doing. And I can be a part of a really great service that you're providing people. And so that's why I want to do this. That's why I'm doing it now.
Yeah, thank you so much for being willing to share your story, all the vulnerable, hard things. Because, wow, yeah, you just, after reading the book, I just sat for an hour just staring, thinking about life, thinking, just processing.
I've heard a lot of people from Bob Jones who told me they had to, it might have taken them 6 months to read it because they could only read it in small bits. People who didn't go to Bob Jones, I had one friend, he said he started reading it on a rainy Saturday afternoon and didn't stop until 3:00 in the morning. It was like candy for him. But for people like us, it triggers so much stuff. Mm-hmm. And like we were talking about at the beginning, I went back into therapy last year because trauma unfolds. You have to do deeper work. And it's a lifetime. Honestly, it's a lifetime mission, and you have to embrace the process. But it does get better. It has gotten better. And that's where I am now with it.
Mm. Yeah. And it was interesting to me how you talked about ego deflation and dealing with that. And I'm really, because I think as human beings, we've created all these different beliefs, religions, and different ways to try to deal with the toughness of our humanity. In fundamentalism, they would call it the flesh. That's what they would call it. And it's what I learned as I got out of fundamentalism was really it just tried to cut you off from your humanity. It tried to cut you off from these tougher parts. It shamed it so much. But I'm curious, were there things as you were healing in therapy that maybe there were parallels in fundamentalism where you were like, oh, they called this, but they approached it this way, but this is a healthier way to approach it. What was like, did you compare? Because I've kind of realized as I've gotten out of fundamentalism is that some people can approach the healing process in the same way they approach sanctification in Christianity. Oh, I have to reach this state of perfection. And it's kind of a similar, they might leave that system, but they take that fundamentalism with them in that mindset. Did you struggle with that in any way?
So one of the things that I learned when 5 years ago, I checked myself into a recovery residence, as some people call it, a halfway house. The program director there, who's one of my best friends today, like within the first week, he said to me, your need to be right is fucking infuriating. And I'm like, but I am right. Like, you don't understand. And I am like, what's the problem? I'm right. But it began the process of my understanding my need to be right, which goes all the way back to fundamentalism, because in fundamentalism, we are right. We do this thing where we say, God told me it's in the book, therefore I am just following. No, it's the opposite of that. Fundamentalists create God in their own image and then give to God that authority to do whatever they want to do and say whatever they want to say. And that's what we're seeing now in our government, because we have a fundamentalist Speaker of the House now. That absolutely terrifies me, because once you decide that you are only doing God's will, you fly jetliners into buildings. That's what Osama bin Laden was doing. That's exactly what all the fundamentalists do. And to deprogram that, to realize, no, that's me giving authority to that God. Then what does that mean? It means I don't know. Once I realized, the idea of not knowing absolutely terrified me. And I had to get to a place where I'm okay not knowing. I don't know what happens when I die. I have a belief system. I've adopted a belief system, but I'm aware of what I'm doing. I'm just adopting a belief system that works for me. But to say that I know, that's the path to treachery.
Yes, that is so true. And I think that's one of the many things that's wrong with Bob Jones University is they're clinging so much to that certainty above anything else. And when I got out of that environment and started researching cults and mind control and different things, I covered this a bit in the Surviving BJU podcast, but Robert J. Lifton, I think he was a psychiatrist who created or really discovered what he would call, it's called Lipton's criteria for thought reform, 8 different things, and I covered on the podcast. And one of the things was doctrine over person. And that was something I saw a lot at Bob Jones and in fundamentalism growing up, is that their doctrine, their interpretation of the Bible, their theology, their approach to life, their application of what they thought were biblical principles, that took importance above everyone else. So all the mistreatment of people in biblical counseling, with sexual abuse survivors, with even like you experiencing harm from that person, they prioritize their worldview, their doctrine over the person. They put it first because they're protecting really like that certainty. And there's there's this narcissism in that environment that we're right. There's a narcissism in that everyone else is wrong. We have the truth. And yeah, when you come to that place where you're right about everything, you will do anything to protect that certainty. And it doesn't matter if it causes harm. And it will blind you to holes that are in the system, because the system can never be wrong. It's always on that person, that blame and that shame. And it just perpetuates a lot of harm, as we've seen through different survivors coming forward through the Surviving BJU podcast, and also as we continue through this podcast. But one last thing I want to dig into is, what were some important lessons that you learned on your healing journey?
So a few years ago, I was at a religious ceremony at a Hindu ashram in Florida, and I heard a recording of the guru who founded it. Her name was Ma Jaya. And Ma Jaya said that the only religion she practices is kindness. And then I heard the Dalai Lama say the same thing. And I thought, if this kindness thing is good enough for the Dalai Lama and Ma Jaya, then maybe it's a good way to live. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm a doormat. In fact, with kindness plus time equals courage. The kinder that I can be over time, the more that I feel my place in the world, and that I can truly then be of service to other people. You know, the other principles I've learned in recovery are vital. Patience, humility, compassion, as you mentioned earlier. For myself, if I can have compassion for me, and compassion begins with self-compassion, like we talked about earlier, the hatred that I felt for Bob Jones III, if I can have compassion for the person who felt that, and at times, honestly, still feels a little bit of tinge of it. If I can have compassion for that person, then I can have compassion for you, and I can eventually have compassion for Bob III, and God forbid, even Jim Berg. During the pandemic, I meditated a lot. Meditation is the key. Also a key. I would say there are 4 pillars to my spiritual practice today. The Buddha's 4 Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a sacred text of Hinduism, the Tao Te Ching, which is where Taoism comes from, and the Sermon on the Mount. I read something from that, at least one of those things every day. And those are my guiding principles. I don't always live up to the kindness. That's the goal. That's what I strive for. And of course, the other things, eat right, exercise, therapy. I've spent half a century chasing my cravings and running away from my aversions. And so now the goal to healing is equanimity.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your journey and just all the things that you've been through and offering your advice to help other people who may be struggling with those same things. And I know it's definitely not easy at all, but thank you for like your book and for coming on, sharing just the wild ride of going through Bob Jones University and then into the Marines, all that you dealt with that, then with all the, oh my gosh, all the trauma from the articles that were published and then dealing with the aftermath. But I want to leave space if there's anything else that you would like to cover or talk about.
I think that's it, Andrew. It's been a pleasure being on your podcast.
Yeah, I thank you so much for coming on. I'm so happy we were able to do this because after the Surviving BJU and when I decided to do this podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to reach out to Rich. I had to, and I was so thrilled when you said you would come on. So thank you so much.
The one thing I would add is the work you're doing is like I said earlier, I get so angry because of the things that are still happening to people, but what you're doing and what the others are doing gives me so much hope that there's so much more space available now, but take care of yourself. You got to take care of yourself first.
Yeah. I'm trying to learn that. Yeah. Making the Surviving BJU podcast, oof, like that was eye-opening for me. And I did have to learn to take breaks throughout that. There were times I wasn't sure if I could finish it, but I'm glad that I got through it. And then now I can work on this podcast. And yes, I will take care of myself. I'll do best that I can. I don't always,
but we need you. You got to carry the torch.
Thank you. But yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on. And for people listening, I have his book, Secrets of a Gay Marine Porn Star, linked below. And for people listening, please leave a 5-star review because that helps other people find the show. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.